Welcome to episode 147 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Lost Guy. It's March 27, 1955. We're in Santiago de Chile, and today's story is about a hat-trick that should have ended at 2. Because on this day in 1955, Argentina beat Uruguay 6-1 in the South American Championship, and Ángel Labruna, already substituted off, came back onto the pitch and completed his hat-trick anyway. But how did we get here? Start with the tournament itself. In 1955, it was still the Campeonato Sudamericano, not yet Copa America by modern branding, but already one of international football's great measuring sticks. And nowhere did that pressure feel heavier than in the Rio de la Plata. Argentina and Uruguay are not just neighbors, they are football mirrors. Buenos Aires and Montevideo sit little more than 100 miles apart across the water, and the football between them has always felt as if the river narrows rather than separates. Each nation grew up measuring itself against the other, and by 1955, both had pedigree to make any meeting feel loaded. Uruguay was still carrying the aura of their Maracanazo in 1950 when they won the World Cup, and their shirts still contained men from that triumph or from that same football generation. Míguez, Tejera, Matías González, Maspoli. Even when the team had changed, the memory had not. Uruguay still arrived with the authority of a country that had twice won the World Cup and twice the Olympic Games, and had long treated the South American Championship as home territory. Argentina, meanwhile, had a different kind of authority. Their domestic football was deep, productive, and glamorous. Guillermo Stabile, the old World Cup scorer turned master coach, had already led Argentina to 6 South American titles across his long spell, with 1955 becoming one of them. And he remains the most decorated coach in the history of Argentina's national team. And this 1955 team mattered for another reason too. Argentina had been absent from the South American Championship for 8 years before returning in Chile. That absence had come amid administrative choices, political currents, player migration, and a broader inconsistency in Argentina's international calendar. So this was not just another title chase, it was a re-entry, a return to the continent's main stage. And into that story steps Ángel Labruna. By 1955, he was already one of the great names in Argentine football. At River Plate, he had been part of La Máquina, that forward line so famous it still lives half as a team and half as a myth. He was a prolific scorer, a sharp inside left, a football brain as much as a finisher, and one of the great competitive faces of River's golden years. His broader career numbers place him among the major scorers in Argentine football history, and his place in River memory is beyond dispute. He was also no young sensation by March 1955. He was 36, a veteran, still dangerous, still clever, and still trusted. The sort of player whose timing can compensate for the legs that no longer arrive quite as early as they once did. And that matters because this story is not about a prodigy doing something impossible. It's about an old master refusing to leave the stage. Argentina's tournament had already set the tone. They beat Paraguay 5-3, Ecuador 4-0, and drew 2-2 with Peru. So when they arrived for Uruguay on March 27, the table had narrowed the stakes. Chile was strong. Argentina knew the Clásico Rio Platense mattered. Argentina knew that they had to beat Uruguay to stay on course before the decisive final date with the hosts, Chile. Uruguay, for their part, was still dangerous. They had beaten Paraguay 3-1, drawn 2-2 with Chile, and then thrashed Ecuador 5-1. This was not some washed-up relic of 1950 wandering into an ambush. It was a real Uruguay side with real names, still fully capable of turning an afternoon poisonous for Argentina. And this is where the match begins. March 27, 1955, Estadio Nacional in Santiago, about 35,000 in attendance. And for half an hour, there is no breakthrough. Then in the 32nd minute, Uruguay strike first through Oscar Míguez. That goal matters because it reminds you what sort of opponent this still was. Míguez was not a footnote. He was one of the men of 1950, one of the names tied to the most famous day in Uruguayan football. So when he put Uruguay ahead, the old order briefly reappeared on the scoreboard. But the lead didn't last. 5 minutes later, Rodolfo Micheli equalized, and then in the 39th minute, Labruna scored. And with that, the match turned. Argentina went from 1-0 down to 2-1 up before halftime. And the swing tells you a lot about this side. They had attack everywhere. Micheli would finish the tournament as top scorer with 8 goals. José Porrejo could hurt you. Labruna could still decide games. This was not an Argentina team waiting for one savior. It was an Argentina team with several. And after the break, it became a monologue. Michele made it 3-1 in the 61st minute. Labruna made it 4-1 in the 71st. And Borreggio added the 5th in the 76th. Argentina 5, Uruguay 1. Against Uruguay, that scoreline already sounds excessive. Against Uruguay with several men from the Maracanazo generation in or around the side, it sounds almost unreal. And then the match became something even stranger. In the 79th minute, Stabile made changes. Michele came off for Santiago Vernazza. Labruna came off for Beto Conde. That should have been the end of Labruna's day. 2 goals, a brilliant afternoon, applause, down the tunnel, into the dressing room. Instead, football in this period was still operating under a looser substitution culture that the modern game would later allow. South American competition rules could be surprisingly fluid, as we talked about a few days ago in episode 140. A man could leave. A man could return. It sounds alien now. In that football world, it was still possible. Beto Conde had barely entered the match for Argentina when Matías González punched him. González, one of Uruguay's 1950 world champions, struck the newly arrived substitute and knocked him out. He was immediately sent off. Conde, dazed and unable to continue, had to leave almost immediately. The enduring version of what triggered this is Conde, with the mischief of a man entering at 5-1, when passing González, asked him, "¿Cómo va el partido?" Or, like, "So how's the match going for you?" Whether phrased exactly that way or not, the anecdote survives because it fits the moment. Swagger, humiliation, temper, and punch. And so comes the unforgettable image for today's OTD episode. Labruna already off, already in the tunnel toward the dressing room, but Stabile gets up and calls him back onto the field, back on for his own substitute. And still the drama wasn't done. 1 minute later, in the 82nd minute, Uruguay won a penalty. Oscar Míguez took the kick, but Julio Elias Musimessi, in Argentina's goal, saved it. That save belongs in the folklore of the match almost as much as the knockout and the re-entry. And then, in the 87th minute, history. Labruna scored again, the 6th goal, his 3rd goal, the Hattrick completed after he'd already been taken off. That is why this match endures. Not just because Argentina beat Uruguay 6-1, which in itself is a starting scoreline, but because the last phase of the game seems to reject modern football logic altogether. A veteran scores twice. He is substituted. His replacement is knocked unconscious. The original starter comes back on. The opposition misses a penalty. And then the restored substitute scores again and completes a hat-trick. It reads like fiction written by someone who had been told to make it less plausible. But so what? In the immediate sense, Argentina had not yet won the tournament that afternoon, but they had done something close to decisive. 3 days later, they beat Chile 1-0, with Michele scoring again, and took the South American Championship. They finished it first, with 4 wins and 1 draw, 18 goals scored and only 6 conceded. It was Argentina's 10th South American title and Stabile's 6th as national team coach. So where does the 6-1 sit in Argentina's history? Not as the final itself, but as an emotional peak, the explosion before the coronation. The afternoon when returning Argentina announced that they were not merely back in the competition, they were back on top of South America. For Labruna, it sits beautifully in the late career chapter. He had already won the South American Championship in 1946. Now he won it again in 1955, as a 36-year-old veteran still capable of deciding the biggest match in the tournament in the most improbable fashion imaginable. 3 years later, he would still be around long enough to go to the 1958 World Cup, which tells you how long his class endured. For Uruguay, the wider arc is harder. This was not the official end of the Maracanazo generation, but it does feel like a marker. Míguez was still scoring. Matías González and Tejada were still there. Maspoli was still in the squad. Yet the authority of 1950 was fading, little by little, into memory and inheritance. Uruguay would remain powerful, of course. They won the South American Championship again the next year, 1956. But by March 1955, the team that had stunned Brazil in Rio no longer looked untouchable. Against Argentina that day, it looked old, provoked, and overrun. And then there's the rules angle. This match, like the Savoy episode in 1963, reminds us that substitution law and competition practice were far from standardized in the way modern football assumes. The game contained local flexibilities and regional customs. Argentina happened to benefit from one in 1955 and then benefited from another in 63. History doesn't always rhyme elegantly, but sometimes it rhymes strangely. Before we go, 3 things to take away from March 27, 1955. First, Argentina's 6-1 against Uruguay was one of the most emphatic scorelines ever produced in this rivalry, and it came against an Uruguay side that still contained real prestige and real names from the Maracanazo era. Second, Ángel Labruna's hat-trick was extraordinary, not just because he scored 3, but because he scored the third after he'd already been substituted off and then sent back on for his own injured replacement. And third, the match became the emotional hinge of the 1955 South American Championship. Argentina beat Chile a few days later to win the title, and the 6-1 remains the tournament's wildest and most memorable afternoon. On this day in 1955, Argentina beat Uruguay 6-1 in Santiago, and Ángel Labruna completed one of international football's impossible hat-tricks, not because he wasn't a prolific goalscorer, he was, but because he had already left the pitch after a brace, was headed for the dressing room, was called back, sent back on, and then, striker as he was, scored once more. That's all for episode 147 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by a 17-loss guy. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow the show, leave a 5-star rating, and share it with all your friends, please. Tomorrow, we head to Turin until March 28, 1976, when the Derby della Mole ended not with a result on the pitch, but with a decision at a desk after Torino's goalkeeper was struck by a rocket from the crowd. See you tomorrow.